about Apex test classes best practices in the Salesforce. But prior than we will go, to the best practices, let us understand, like what is the actual testing, right, in terms of Apex unit tests. So unit tests are actually, like tests that are performed by developers to ensure that functionality is working, like as expected, and considering both positive and negative items, and like the appropriate code coverage is, like provided. We should also not focus, like just on the percentage of code coverage, but we should make sure that, like we are testing our code as, like it's required. Sometimes when we design, for example, our Apex classes, what we could do is we could design our signatures of our classes, signatures of our methods, right? And then on top of them, we could actually write our unit tests. And, like once we will have a unit test, so then after this, what we could do is we could actually start and write the actual implementation of that specific methods. Sometimes the same kind of, like of the technique is used, like to ask some developers to write their own code and test, like for example in some interviews or in some for example certification exam or in other places. I mean, where like we have our unit tests upfront the actual development, but sometimes we also could use that specific technique when we're doing like design of our logic. And in terms of our testing, right, the ways how we could actually test our logic is in the following. It's we could test, for example, single records, right? It's that, for example, in our method, we will pass only one record and we will take a look what is, like expected results. Then it could be bulk records when we will pass a couple of records, like from the trigger or, for example, just as a collection into the specific, like method and see how it will behave, like based on the, like bulk records, right? So then we could apply here two different scenarios, like for example, it's mentioned here positive scenario and negative scenario. So it's in the following, like for example, when during the testing we will actually insert into our code, like some positive scenarios, right, when our test should pass, right, and some negatives, like for example when we're passing some error or when we're given some null pointer data, right, to our methods, and let's see how they will behave when we will pass them, not for example a record but a null, for example, or a subject but without retrieving appropriate field, right? So let's see how it will go. And also one more possible scenario, right, it's a possibility for us to test it under the restricted user, like for example when we create the specific user in the context of the Apex unit test class. So then we could actually test how that specific function works for that specific user. Let's say, is there enough permissions in terms of the permission set assigned to that user or based on his profile, right? And sometimes we need to actually see that some specific logic should return us an error when you, for example, don't have enough level of access. So all this kind of stuff could actually be used with this, like restricted users. So, like it's some basics related to, like what to test and how to test, right? And let's now jump to the best practices of test classes in the Salesforce, right? So first item is, like it's more like in consideration that our class should start with is test annotation. So I don't believe that it's, like a best practice, but whatever. So next one is, like focus on 90 plus. To deploy to production, we should have at least 75% of code coverage. So it's requirement. And sometimes we need to focus on, like even bigger amount of percentage for our code coverage. So why it's happening, right? It's happening because sometimes, for example, we could be in a position when some classes, like covered more, another classes covered less, right? But in general, our code coverage for entire, let's say, chunk of the code that we would like to migrate to the prod should be bigger than 75%. So that's why if you have somewhere, like additional code coverage, it will help you a lot. Also, because like you covered 90+% of your, let's say, class, you could be pretty confident that it's working, like as expected, if you, like did it like based on this, like let's say number of rules. One assert statement per method. Always put assert statement for negative and positive tests, like system assert, where we can comparing condition and message, system equal or system not equal. So I don't believe that, like only one assert statement per method is really required, right? I think that more idea here is for us to have at least one, let's say, assert, right, per our method, because if you have just a method which just invokes some function, right, but it's actually checking not checking for actual results. It's actually doing nothing, right? It just was created for the code coverage. Let's say sometimes we could see a situation when it's need to be quickly added, like in critical situation. But of course, if we would like to, like provide the, let's say, good quality of our project, we need to make sure that, like our unit is really testing something. So then what is mentioned here, use test setup to create the test records once in a method and use them in every test method in our test class. Yeah, so it's a possibility for us to use this annotation test setup, right, and define a separate method in our unit test. And all of kind of test record creation we could actually have here and then not duplicate it in every other method. And then we could just, like another method, just SQL the data like it, for example, already exists. And in that manner, this test setup, it will be like already executed prior to that specific, let's say, unit test. So another item is create a test factory class with this test annotation to execute from organization code size limit. To exclude from the organization code size limit. All right. So what is test factory, right? Test factory, it's kind of a class where we could actually predefine the creation of different kind of, let's say, entities required for our code to be tested. Like, for example, case creation, user creation, or for example, sysadmin user creation, support user creation, for example, case record type with, like installation case, or for example, customer failure case, right? So all this, like different kind of possible scenarios for us to not repeat ourselves in different kind of unit tests, but have, like, let's say, a common library or a common factory where we could create all this kind of records, right? This really help us, like later, to have only one unified place to control our code. And if in the future, for example, some kind of field, like for example, description field was changed on the case, right, and now it's required, so you could see in how many places we have to modify our unit test. But with the test data factory, you should do it only in one place. Okay, so next one, see all data equal to true. Always use see all data equal to false at the class or method level. Use profile organization, async jobs, current triggers, apex classes, components we can access without see all data true. Yeah, so what is, like this annotation see all data? So it's actually, we should not add it by default, right? So by default, it's already equal to false. But if you thinking about usage of it, right? So the main idea of that annotation is in the following. So it's allowing our let's say unit test class to see real data on the org, right, where we're executing those unit tests, because the actual idea of the context of unit test that is executed in its own context, right? And when it's doing, like all this, let's say, manipulation with DB, it's actually not really, like after the execution of unit test, insert them into the real database. So that's why, like see this all data, right, allowing us to see real data on the org. But in general, we should prepare all this test data in our unit test class. As an Apex run a system mod, so the permissions and record sharings are not taken into account. So we need to use system run S to enforce record sharings. Yeah, so as we just discussed it, if for any reason you will have to run that specific tests for the restricted user, and we'll test if that user could see some records or couldn't see, right? Or if, for example, sharings added or sharings, like removed, so you could this system run S. I think that below we will be able to see some kind of code examples. So next one, avoid using hard-coded IDs. So I think it's, like a common pattern. Government limits, test start, test, and test stop test. Yeah, so we could use actually test start test. It's possibility for us to get, let's say, a new set of government limits for each X stage of tests, right? And it's actually allowing us to get results of the previously returned operations. Like, for example, if somewhere you have a situation when you have a synchronous job, right, which is running, or for example, like allowed to external system with this test, start test and test stop test, right, you could put it, like prior and after that specific code, and that means that, like after test stop test, you will be able to make sure that, like your, let's say, asynchronous operations that you are trying to test, like for example, batch job or queuable apex or cloud, right, is already completed. So that's test stop test, not just, like giving you a new set of government limits, but also, like making sure that you understand that your asynchronous job will be completed when, that specific line of code will be added or after the specific line of code. Testing exceptions. Any exceptions that occur in the production method should be tested by finding the test data through exception type, and error message should be asserted. Yeah, so it's also one of the patterns for testing, right? It's related to negative testing when we have some exception and we expect this exception to be showing up. So then of course we need to test our code, right, and test that it's actually showing up. Exercise bulk trigger functionality twist at least 200 of records in your tests. Alright, so this point is, I think, understandable. So how to create a test data? Manually to create it for each test. To create a test method, we can use test method keyword or is test annotation variable in the context. Cons a lot of duplicated code. Agree. Load data via CSV file from a static resource. We can use test load data method to create our test data in our test class. So the way how we could do it, as you could see here, right, we have this test class, right? So that's why we should not name our new classes as a test, right, because it's already reserved name. So then we have this load data. So then we're specifying this object type, right, and we are loading it with appropriate type. So pros of this, we don't need to make code updates for records creation, and cons, it might be harder to track changes into the static resources. But alright, so next one is test setup, right, which is marked as a best practice, right, and it's related to the following. We could create one test setup, right, prior to other test methods, right, and all what we have here, like for example creation of the account using test data factory, right, or creation of a contact and opportunity based on account that we created here. It will be much easier, and then all other methods will already have the data. So then it looks like here we have an example of test data factory, right? Single location to update the schema in the code, variables out of the context. Let's see, what do we have in terms of example of this test data factory. So here we have some methods, that creating the data for us, like for example, create lead, right? And here we are passing our boolean. Should we actually insert that record or not, right? And as you could see, what we are doing is if our boolean is true, then we are inserting that record. If not, then we are just returning the instance of that record prepared, right, but not yet inserted into the DB. The same for the conversion of the lead, right? We have a functionality for us to pass that lead here, actually inform, let's say, perform this database lead convert function. So then possibility for us to get this convert status, right, and then return back what we have. So then creation of account. You see the basic idea, right, of the test data factory. It's actually we are preparing some data here, right, instances of those data, right, and then we could use it from other places. So then consideration, test class did not commit the data which is created in the test method, so we don't need to delete the test data which is created in the test classes. Yeah, it's true. So that, as I just mentioned earlier, right, so everything what we inserted in terms of the unit test level is actually not something that really will be inserted into the database. So I think that also what we have here, it's we have different kind of conditional annotations. I could see that they are marked here, like for example test visible. So this test visible, it's annotations that we could actually add to the private, let's say, members of the class, right, that we would like to test, and then it will be visible in terms of the related unit test class. But we need to be accurate with this, like test visible, because generally when we have some function in the class which is marked as private, right, that means that like that function is used as like internal function to that class, and it will be never invoked like directly, and that means that like you could really think like about your test strategy. Let's say if there will be no code that is actually invoked directly, right, and it's always controlled via, for example, entry point of that specific class. So maybe testing of that function could also be through the entry point. But if your testing approach is like related to the way how you're actually like going through this let's say functions, right, so then if you're doing it in a manner of function by function, then of course you could use it. So then like load data we already discussed it, run as we already discussed, and start and stop test we also discussed it. Alright, test method and test classes are not counted as a part of the code limits. Yeah, so if you guys don't know, let's say per organization, we have, like code limits as how many Apex code characters, right, we could have for our organizations, like for example more than 3 million of Apex code, like symbols or something like this. And that means that, like our unit test or any kind of test which is marked or any kind of class which is marked with annotation is not counted against of the general organization limits related to this, as well as, like as you could move some of your code into the package, right, and then install that package into your organization, and then via that manner you will be able, like if you are near with that limit, like to divide your code and still continue, like to introduce new classes. So next one, system debug statements are not counted as a part of the Apex code limits. Let's say I'm again not sure why it's a part of the Apex test classes best practice, but wherever. Is test annotation with the test method is equivalent to test method keyword? All right. Test class and methods default access is private, no matter to add a specific specifier. Okay. Classes with this test annotation can be inherit interface or enum. All right. Test methods can be invoked by a not test request. Starting with the Salesforce IP28, test methods cannot reside inside not test classes. Yeah, it was a good change. Test visible annotation make our private method visible for unit test. That method can be used to test web services callout. Please use callout mock. Yes, that's true. You can send emails from test methods, real emails. No, see all data will not work for APIs 23 version or earlier. So I think nobody uses that version at this moment, I think. We can run a unit test by using Salesforce standard UI, force.com IDE, earn console, and API. Yeah. So in terms of running unit tests, right, and getting code coverage, of course, we have a possibility to run them through the Visual Studio Code. We have a possibility, as it's mentioned here, right, use, let's say, developer console, right, and we have a possibility for us to run it through the API, right, and also you run them through the standard UI. So if you are going to the setup, you're looking for tests, right, and then you could execute your unit tests. System run as will not enforce user permission on the field or field level permissions. Okay, every test to run as count against the total number of DML issued in the process. Test environment support test visible tested as well. Test method should be static and no void return type. So I think it's idea to mention that they should not return anything. Assessing static resources, test records in the test class, the list name equal to load data. Right. Yeah, so I think that in terms of the basics, right, I think the basics we covered at the very beginning of that article, right, in terms of, like how we should do, what kind of code coverage we should get, that we should use asserts, right, we should use test setup, right, we should not use see all data, we could use run as, we should use test start test and test stop test to make sure, when we are working with asynchronous operations that they will be completed, that we need to test exceptions, right, and we could check our bulk code functionality, right. Let's say all these items are actually, let's say, basic best practices, right? So in terms of other best practices, of course, we could define those which are related, like the way how we are naming our test class. Let's say if we have our class name it as annotation, right, then we could have our unit test class name it with annotation test. If we have a method, like for example, and method marked as deployed to prod, right, so then as a part of the test method, which is testing that specific method, we should have something like a deployed to prod test like negative or deployed to prod positive test, right, or something like this. And when we will run our unit tests through, for example, developer console, when we will expand, right, and we will see which one of them are actually passing, which of them not, right, we will be able to easily by the name understand, like what exactly logic is not working, right, related to which specific use case. And what is else related to unit tests, that in different organizations we could have our quality gates, right? When, for example, we are working through, for example, our pipeline, and we are promoting one code from one environment to another, we could of course run our unit test check, right, which will make sure that we have appropriate code coverage, right, and it will make sure that some classes that don't have enough code coverage, that actually they are not promotable. So that means that, like, we will at least increase in our company, let's say code quality, right, in terms of code coverage that is related to our code, because it's better to do it right now, right, when some developer who develop it based on logic, like, understand what is done, right, then, like, return to it back later, right, when somebody will need to see it and take a lot of time, like, to understand, like, what is the class doing, and then provide related unit tests. So it's also, like, one of the best practices is to have, like, unit tests completed as a part of the definition of done of user story. So definition of done, it's actually, like a checklist of different kind of items that we should actually include into our, like, definition, where we could, let's say, suggest that user stories, like, completed all of kind of stages related to the, like, development, right? So that means that, for example, documentation is done, unit tests, like, done, and appropriate code coverage is provided here. And, like, another best practice is, like, when we're updating the actual class, right, it's to make sure that the related unit test class is updated, or at least if we're running the related unit test, that there will be no new failures or something like this, right? We always need to make sure that our unit tests are, let's say, related to our Apex class are actually correct and they are working as expected. So I think that's all related to very, very basics related to Apex unit test best practices. So thank you guys for attention.